All right. So our next speaker is Dominic Edsall. He's a doctoral candidate at the UCL Institute of Education and also an assistant professor in medical communication at the Kyoto Prefectural University of Medicine. His research interests include learner autonomy and agency, teacher development, teacher professionalism, knowledge practices within EFL teaching, motivation and CLIL, and the sociology of EFL teaching. I'm also happy to say that he's a colleague and friend of mine. I've read some drafts of his work in autonomy, and it is going to knock your socks off. You will definitely be impressed by this, and you'll be seeing this in print within a few years, I am sure. Okay, no pressure, Dominic. All right.
No pressure. Well, first of all, can you see my slides or my notes? Because I was having terrible problems earlier, but are we okay with that, Thomas? Good. Okay. Hang on a second. Let me just, yeah. Let me move around a little bit. Okay. So, I'm lost view. Let's have a look. No. Okay. Unfortunately, I can't see people. Got multiple screens, but okay. Let me. All right. So, Thomas, can you hear me? I can't actually see anybody at the moment.
You're coming through just fine.
Oh, okay, great. Right. So, let me get started then. So, my name is Dominic Edsall. I'm a doctoral candidate at UCL's Institute of Education. I came to critical realism through my PhD studies. The UCL is very keen on everyone having their epistemology really kind of really solidified, and this in some way, I'll explain a little bit more, but I'm going to make the argument that I think we can understand some, particularly learner autonomy, much better with critical realism. And if you watched Jeremy's talk, I think you understand why I say better rather than just understanding learner autonomy. But we'll talk about that a little more. Now, okay, so as I said, I came to this through my doctoral studies. So some of this, my argument for why critical realism helps us to better understand learner autonomy is based on my empirical research. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that first. Then I'm going to talk about critical realism as meta theory. Now, in this sense, in a more practical sense, I'll explain as we go along. I'm going to give a kind of critical realist perspective on learner autonomy, and particularly on some of the literature that the base of learner autonomy, since it became a very researched and a kind of a focus for a lot of teaching, and particularly language teaching. I'm going to very briefly talk about critical realism, complex dynamic systems perspectives and learning. I have a slightly different perspective on things because I was a chemistry teacher a long time ago when I had hair, and I've dealt with complex dynamic systems in the natural sciences. And so I have a slightly different perspective on this. So I'm going to kind of show how we have to be a little bit careful with it, but how it fits with critical realism and particularly with learning. I'm then going to talk about learner autonomy, agency, and an ecological model of learning. So, for example, in the abstract, I mentioned Bronfenbrenner, if that's the correct way to pronounce it. we're going to talk about that and how there have been calls in the second language acquisition community to bring together cognitive and social perspectives. And we're going to talk about that and doing that with an ecological model of learning. All right, then I'm going to talk a little bit about trajectories of change and a layered reality. Now, we'll see how these maybe are helpful in understanding learner autonomy, given what, for example, what Jeremy has said about the layers of empirical, actual, and real. Okay. And then I'm going to show you a proposed model of learner autonomy, which is, I guess, one of the products of my PhD research, and show how that fits within critical realism and how we can build up a layered picture of learner autonomy to better understand it. Okay, so what we've got first then is I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research. Well, up until COVID, I was constantly going between the UK and Japan. I teach in Japan, and but my PhD is back in the UK. There are some, I guess, my understanding of learner autonomy and my appreciation for how critical realism could help better understand it has been informed by this research. So I want to kind of give a little example. It's qualitative research. So it was semi-structured interviews with 52 EFL teachers and 35 Japanese students from 12 different universities across Japan. It took a long time, but it built up a very interesting kind of picture of practices around learner autonomy within EFL teaching at Japanese universities. And yeah, as I mentioned before, this is this appreciation of learner autonomy through a lens of critical realism is kind of an extension of all of this doctoral research. Okay, so what I want to do then is first of all is to get you kind of thinking about some of the ideas I was concerned with are some of my research questions that I used. So we had this research question like, how do tertiary teachers at the university level successfully foster autonomy in their students? How does the act of fostering autonomy fit within the social context of learning? What are teachers' and students' beliefs and attitudes towards negotiating a change in learner autonomy? And how does the social context of past learning mediate student and teacher attitudes towards learner autonomy in the present? And what effect does quantitative policy have upon the qualitative expression of autonomy at the pedagogic and personal levels? Okay, so that's quite a lot of questions. What I'd like to do, if we can, is I would like to I'd like you to actually take a break for a second, and maybe we can do breakout rooms. We'll put people into breakout rooms, and I'd like you to try and answer these questions. What do you think the answers to these questions would be? All right, so let me just see if I can find the breakout rooms, and we already have. Let's recreate the room. So we've got a number of people there. Okay, so let's do that then. Let me find the PowerPoint again. We have these questions. How do you think, how do tertiary teachers at the university level successfully foster autonomy in their students? how does the act of fostering autonomy fit within the social context of learning? And what are teachers and students' beliefs and attitudes towards negotiating a change in learner autonomy? How does the social context of past learning mediate student and teacher attitudes towards learner autonomy in the present? And what effect does quantitative policy have upon the qualitative expression of autonomy at the pedagogic and personal levels? Okay, so what I'll do is I'm going to put people into breakout rooms and give you, I'll say 5 minutes, but you'll end up being 2 or 3 to talk, pick one of these questions and discuss it in the breakout room. Okay.
Yeah.
So all right, I hope everybody's managed to come back, is back with us. These questions, and they're I think if we take one of the ideas of critical realism and apply it to what we think are the answers to these questions, we have to be honest about some of the presuppositions. So the things that that are maybe biasing our kind of answers to it. So obviously our personal experience will affect some of these attitudes, and our own perspective will kind of maybe kind of shape our answers as well. We can't really escape that from through interviews, for example, or quantitative examples, right? So let me move on slightly and talk about some of the research problems that we also had, right? So firstly, one that is learner autonomy is usually considered to be a characteristic of the individual in much of the literature, right? And some of these questions I'm asking are very social. We're thinking about the kind of the interface between the individual and the classroom, and the individual and the teacher, individual and various social groupings. And something else that comes up is the specific context, and we have this portrayal of Japanese students as, or in much of the literature, as being or lacking autonomy, particularly if you ask teachers and researchers who maybe are not focused on autonomy. They will say, oh, maybe the students, they're all the same, or there's this myth of Japan's homogeneous society, and particularly a myth about the egalitarian school society that a lot of people in power like to propagate because it serves some of their purposes. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through, and how that affects learner autonomy as well. Another problem we have is that there's a range of analytical lenses available. We could talk about cognitive capacity, we could talk about motivation, we could talk about critical reflection, social mediation, interaction, negotiation, student agency, teacher agency, social structure, field, habitus. So habitus being a disposition to action that is transposable across different social fields. You could talk about social capital, so the value of learner autonomy within a particular social field or culture. We talk about curriculum issues, we could talk about assessment, particularly washback, the effect of entrance exams, and the effect in Japan is something that's been studied a lot and looked at in terms of affecting learner behavior. And then there's policy at the kind of government level as well that we could talk about. One thing I will say straight off, I'm probably more comfortable with quantitative stuff. I used to be a chemistry teacher. I've done a lot of math, I've taught math. The problem here is that a lot of the quantitative instruments for learner autonomy have proved unreliable, right? And unlike with a lot of the motivational kind of research that's gone on, there aren't many kind of quantitative instruments that we can look at that actually are reliable to dealing with learner autonomy at a personal level. Kyoko Horai, professor down in Kumamoto at Sojo University, did a very good study on using confirmatory factor analysis to look at various different kind of quantitative instruments for autonomy, and found they weren't that reliable. So we know we've got to do something qualitative, but we've got all of these different options to go through. So in some ways it's difficult. We've got we've got a whole toolbox, but each of them has their slight problems. So is it possible then to adopt a critical realism perspective to help, maybe not to help choose the tools, or help to choose the combination of tools that we might use? All right, so let's talk about critical realism as meta theory. All right, now, okay, right. So Roy Bhaskar, pictured here, helped develop critical realism as a meta theory to improve understanding of the world. He, along with Margaret Archer, tried to improve our understanding of a whole base of epistemology and ontology in a way that was much more inclusive and progressive. As Jeremy's talked about, that one fundamental principle is ontological realism, right? But there's another phrase that gets used a lot, which is this underlaboring. So asking, as Jeremy has explained, is asking what would have to be for what we know to be true. All right, so asking what mechanism, underlying generative mechanism did we has happened to get us to the place where we are now. And there's this other problem that is particularly relevant here, is this idea of complexity of freedom. A lot of the, particularly the early work on learner autonomy, tried to get it fixed to a closed system, or tried to theorize as a closed system, as only within the individual, for example. Whereas what we really have in reality is it's a much more open system. All right, so we have to think about it as more of an open system, which is very different from a closed system. And as I mentioned before, we have to have this reflexive honesty about the presuppositions. So we have to think very carefully about when we're considering what we understand to be true, how do we get to that understanding of what we consider to be true? Now, what we're going to, let me just, okay. So what we have here, Jeremy talked about layers of reality. And what we've got here is Bhaskars, sorry, I've managed to spell that incorrectly. I'll change it before I send out the notes. What we've got here is a kind of diagram relating all of these different layers of reality within the model. So, okay, let me find this one. Okay, so for example, we've got these, everything within reality happens within a plane of material transactions. So within the biosphere, within reality, you've got to make certain transactions within. You know, we've got to eat, we've got to drink water, we've got to breathe in air. These kind of things are always kind of happening. And so we always have material transactions with nature. But there are also social interactions between people. We don't live completely on an island, or we live within a social environment. So there's a kind of a plane of social interaction, social reactions, social interactions. And then there's also a plane of social relations, okay? We have things that are enabling or constraining us, okay? And within ourselves, we have this stratification of personality. So we think about, from a critical realism perspective, even ourselves, we have different layers to ourselves. So we have these different dimensions that we got to think about, these different layers, right? So we've got the material transactions with nature, we've got social interactions between people, we've got social structure, we've got stratification of the embodied personality. So within our personality, there are different layers as well. Okay. And we have this other idea, which is important, which is that social activity is concept dependent, but not concept exhausted. So we can use various concepts to understand social activity, but we're not limiting our understanding to just those concepts. We can go beyond it with, we modify and change our conceptualization as we go along. So we're not limiting ourselves by adopting a particular concept to understand social activity, because we can change and adjust it as we go through. All right. Right. So learner activity must exist at least in one of these dimensions and be active in two others. So as we'll talk about more, like traditional conceptualizations of learner autonomy are going to be mainly focused on the individual layer. So we're talking about these stratified layers within the person. But though learner autonomy itself is active within both social interactions and also within the institution. So Basco also talked about these distinct levels of agency and structure. And this is something that which leads into the ecological model, which we'll talk about a bit later. So he uses the word sub-individual, let's say psychological, individual, biographical, micro, ethno-methodological, meso, so relations between functional roles, macro, functioning of whole sectors of society, mega, whole traditions, and then we talk about world systems and stuff. So this question here is, we've got to think about traditional conceptualizations of learner autonomy. Is it only just at the psychological level, the cognitive level? Well, critical realism has and Basco has a model for the formation of action and agency within the individual. So this is like a slice of that stratified layer. And if we look at this, we have, this is reflexive deliberation. So we're talking about lots of different things happening in a complex way at this stage. So this cognitive, conative. Anybody who knows learner autonomy will recognize some of these things. So we've got motivation and drive, okay? We've got things like the affective domain, okay? So in SIA language, we might talk about an affective filter, for example. And we've got other things here which all add to it. We've got the cognitive domain, and we'll talk, and beliefs, values, okay? So what this model shows us is that these are all adding together to slowly build up these competencies and facilities to then eventually affect action. Then these consequences of action feed back to the next conditions of action. So we can see we've got a kind of a feedback loop, right? So within critical realism as a meta theory, we can see we can add some of these things, which we'll talk about a bit more, adding together. So this idea is that within the person, you're thinking about all of these different things, whether it's an internal conversation or unconsciously, to help you inform your actions. Okay. So, so from critical realism perspective, we have this stratified reality, and it working across all levels of reality. And then we, at the critical realism level, we have a way of a meta theory to arrange all these different ideas within the kind of psychological or individual layer as well. So we've got this question still: what level does learner autonomy operate, and what about the social parts? Well, let's step back and let's go talk about Holek, one of the original definitions, or possibly the most quoted definition of learner autonomy, as the capacity to take charge of learning, and backed up by Little, for example, in 1991, who said, yes, it's definitely a cognitive capacity for taking charge of learning. But when you actually read Holek, and I suspect a lot of people who quote Holek haven't read Holek, you can actually see that a lot of it is traced back to the cognitive psychology of Schwartz from the 1970s. And Holek specifically says that this idea is to avoid problems of I think he talks about chaos of a social system or an open system. So in some ways, it's a deficit model of learner autonomy. If we think about the critical realist perspective, we're only talking about this point here, the cognitive domain. And if a student doesn't show learner autonomy, they must therefore lack the cognitive capacity to do learner autonomy, which doesn't really fit with the Japanese model, because you have Japanese context, because you have a lot of students who maybe in English are not so great, but in other subjects they obviously have the cognitive capacity for study and learning. So it doesn't really work. It's effectively it's a model blaming the students when the teacher fails to encourage learner autonomy. It's kind of like, no, it's not my problem. They just don't have the cognitive capacity to deal with it, which from our critical realist perspective shows it's just not sufficient. So, okay, so let's think about let's think about another perspective. And we've got this model, this complex dynamic systems model from Tassinari, 2012. And we can start to see that in this model, we can see that we're starting to get some of these different layers from the critical realist perspective as well. So this is based on a very large body of learner autonomy literature, just SLA literature, second language association, acquisition literature about learner autonomy. But it's very much focused on the individual level, right? But it assumes micro and meso levels, right? So higher levels of agency. It's really a tool for reflexive deliberation, right? We want our students in the self to actually think about learner autonomy, but it's not really a complete model of it. So it's not really informed by critical realism, but it's still compatible with it, because it recognizes that it's not just our understanding of learner autonomy is not limited to just the cognitive capacity. There are other things going on. There's evaluating, there's cooperating, right? Things happening at different levels of our social picture. So, okay, so it's got a lot of elements that are analogous, right? And there's a problem that comes up. While learner autonomy is treated as being very separate from agency in applied linguistics and SLA literature, within critical realism, there's not much difference. This model here is all about, from critical realism, is all about agency, really. But yet we can see that we can trace parts of it to models of learner autonomy. So how Tassinari's model is a complex dynamic system perspective, and it's about learning, and learning is complex, but it's dynamic, but we have a slight problem here in that I'm going to kind of skip over this a little bit, but basically the problem here is that the complex dynamic systems perspectives, the perspectives does a lot of heavy lifting. Unlike critical realism, which very honestly opens up about its fallibility and saying like we can't possibly know everything. The complex dynamic systems perspectives, there's a certain claim there to scientific and empirical and positivistic perspectives. And so it's slightly problematic. I think we don't have a huge amount of time, so I'm going to kind of skip over this a little bit. So it has explanatory power, this kind of model, but we've got to be very careful. The errors in the system are unknown, right? So it's difficult to apply mathematical simulations, whereas complex dynamic systems, they need to have those mathematical simulations for them to be effective. All right. Running out of time, so I'm going to skip across a lot of this, right? So again, it's invoking a social standing of empiricism, but not really providing useful benefits. Okay, so how does this fit with learning? Well, learning happens all the time, and we, as teachers, we're looking for learning about specific points, the points we're teaching, but often students are learning something else. So really learning is happening all the time. It's a question of trying to keep this idea of this complexity in our heads without reducing it down to something which is too simplistic, but maybe helpful, or sorry, maybe easier to keep in our heads. So moving along, learner autonomy, agency, right? So let's go back again. What about the actual research? So what I found was that nearly every teacher reported having a hybridized conceptualization of learner autonomy. They were influenced by the teacher's disposition towards learner autonomy, the teacher's disposition towards institutional goals, and their disposition towards the means available, and the teacher access to different social fields. So actually, the actual idea that teachers have about learner autonomy is much more biased by their, or not biased, but formed by their own situation within society than many people would think. There's a I can explain this. I'm going to explain this a little more, but it's getting away from the simplicity of what people think of learner autonomy. And learner autonomy was never that simple. So we have here Lenny Dam's flower model of learner autonomy, and we can see that just within her classroom, we've got negotiation going on. We've got different resources and different outcomes, objectives, contributions, evaluations going on. And really, when we start to look at the social perspectives on learner autonomy, we find that they're not that simple. The simplest definitions from Lenny Dam, learner autonomy as the learner making socially responsible decisions in pursuit of learning. So maybe they do have the capacity, the cognitive capacity for learner autonomy, but they're making social choices and socially responsible decisions. So there might be occasions when they don't display learner autonomy, right? It exists in an open system. So if we look at social perspectives, we look at two E's, kind of look at learner autonomy stroke agency, where the boundaries are starting to be between learner autonomy and agency are starting to be a little bit broken down. We start seeing that this layering or separation of things through enablements and constraints, right? And if we recall the Basker's model, that had the different layers of socialization with enablements and constraints. So there's this multi-dimensional negotiation for agency, resources, and position or practice. All right. So we end up with this model of stratified reality, agency affected by access to or action on practices and resources, enablements and constraints. At the individual level, we're taking action based on enablements and constraints, whether it be our affective filters or our motivations or our confidence in our abilities to do things. So there's this link between autonomy at the intrapersonal level or the individual level and agency at the individual level. So we've got to start asking about the social parts of the research. Okay, so this brings us to the ecology model of learning. Bronfenbrenner, 1979, suggested an ecological model of learning within different layers. And this is a kind of updated version. The Douglas Fir Group, which is a very large group of second language acquisition scholars who came together to write a joint paper, are kind of calling for the combining of cognitive and social perspectives. So an epistemological gap, effectively. So we've got cognitive people who will look at language acquisition from a cognitive perspective, looking at it just from the individual, and you've got people working from the social perspective. And they demanded that they come together, adapting this Bronfenbrenner model. Now, where does critical realism come in? Well, if we think about critical realism, we can use it as underlaboring to bring these together. Right? The Douglas Fir Group kind of says, okay, well, Bronfenbrenner suggested this, and this kind of works, so let's just use this. Whereas if we use the critical realism, we can actually start arranging all of the different analytical lenses we might want to put into this to understanding learning. But how about the learner's experience of learner autonomy? Well, let's go back a second. So if we're talking about learner autonomy, then, and we want to see learner autonomy, then learning has to be taking place, right? Now, let's step back a second and let's think about the individual. We can't see the underlying generative mechanisms, but we can imagine that students have a kind of direct trajectory through their learning experience. So they maybe have a positive experience, as suggested by Williams. Okay, this is I'll give the. Actually, maybe we can go to the. This is from Williams, 1999. It'll be in the references. Basically, we can say that somebody has a positive experience and they might follow this kind of trajectory, or somebody might have a negative experience and follow this trajectory. And you have various points going through it. So we can imagine that somebody's learning journey, they will have positive and negative experiences about learner autonomy, right? So we can imagine that this underlying generative mechanism is a bit like a kind of trajectory of learning through their careers as students, right? So this is a possible model for this underlying generative mechanism. You have learning going on. Sometimes they have a positive experience about learner autonomy, sometimes not. Some changes in control by what the teachers do will induce a reaction. So when one teacher is more controlling than another, that's the student's going to learn about that teacher, about the learning process with that teacher. So what you end up with is you've got these trajectories. So they're going to be positive and negative events affecting this disposition towards learner autonomy. Now, Jerry mentioned this this layered reality. So the domain of the empirical, what we see, the actual, so the events that happen that are observed and unobserved. So, you know, I know that on Monday morning, my second period class had a class in the first period. I haven't seen what happened, but it will have affected their trajectory of learning, right? So we imagine that at the domain of the real, we've got these structure and mechanisms that generate events, right? So we can imagine we can impose maybe this trajectory on the kind of domain of the empirical, actual and real. So what do we get? Well, we've got an empirical, we've got the actual, we've got the real. Let's imagine most of our students, then they're not particularly autonomous, maybe have very negative experiences in our class. But what we're not seeing is all the other stuff that's happening, all right? So in my research, I found that students talking about clubs and cram schools and alternative provision for learning that's going on unobserved outside the university. And of course, there's all this other structure going on underneath and all the other kind of things happening that we can't imagine. So what we're seeing, what we can imagine is that the students go through this kind of with a different trajectories, and what we're actually seeing at the top might be quite negative, but we don't know. Okay. So some of this comes, we've already talked about, like the myth of Japanese homogeneity. So students, well, particularly young students, like to be part of the group. So you're going to get some reinforcement of this myth. There's this myth of Japan's egalitarian school system. It's not. And there's also there's evidence of a hidden curriculum. So each school has slightly different ways of teaching things, and there's some separation there. That's all happening in the actual, right? So we know that these events are happening both observed and unobserved. So when it comes to the teacher negotiation and learner autonomy, we mentioned these things already. So it's affected by the teacher's disposition towards learner autonomy, the institutional goals, the means available to them, their access to different social fields. So if a teacher is tenured or not tenured, they might see more of the university students and see what else is happening. And what I did in my research was arrange teachers into this dynamic typology. Now, I'm briefly aware of the time, so I'm going to kind of skip over a little bit and get on to the main point, which is that this layer between the students and the teacher is a kind of a site of reinterpretation and change. The teachers are interpreting the institutional goals, the institutional policies, the structures from the institution, and this gives, and they do it in different ways. So the students' experiences are very different, even within the same institution. So, and then at the intrapersonal level, there's enforcement and lack of student engagement, maybe. So then you have a self-sustaining negative cycle of experiences, right? So we've got at the interpersonal level, right? Teachers, they reported evidence of student agency, habitus, so these transposable dispositions to do things, mediation, interaction, negotiation, pedagogy, different kind of things going on there. At the classroom level, the teachers are talking about their own agency as well. So that kind of brings it all in. So if we think about learning and autonomy and what the teachers are doing, all these different things with autonomy, we have to kind of factor in this, these dynamic differences and reinterpretation by the teacher within this much larger macro model of learning. So how would we put learner autonomy into it? Well, so what I was saying before, we've got the Bronfenbrenner, and it fits within, we recall again the critical realism having these different layers, this meta theory, and it fits within this. And I've arranged it so you can see, like, we've got the sub-individual layer, the individual, macro, meso, macro, and he goes above to mega and planetary. But if we're trying to construct a model of autonomy or agency, we've got to kind of, critical realism tells us that we've got to have a kind of stratified, laminated system to really understand what's going on. All right, so let's ask this question. At the beginning, I said there were all these different analytical lenses. We've got the cognitive capacity, we've got motivation, critical reflection, mediation, interaction, negotiation, agency, field, habitus, capital. How could we arrange all of these ideas about learner autonomy within this idea of this ecological model of learning informed by critical realism? And this is kind of the sum of, not the sum, but one of the important proposals from my PhD is that we could arrange evidence of learner autonomy at each level according to both Bronfenbrenner and Basker, and we could come up with a model for learner autonomy at different stratified layers. So we've got interpersonal level, cognitive capacity. So you could, if you really like Holick, you could put Holick in there. Motivation, metacognition, critical reflection, habitus, and interpersonal, student agency, mediation, the classroom level, and then also the institutional level. So the things that this university does to encourage things like learner autonomy, if they have a self-access learning center, things like this, how the curriculum and the assessment is set up. And then at the national level as well, so active learning, how does the MEC's policy on active learning affect learner autonomy? So it kind of tries this in a lot of ways, helps answer some of these questions. If we look at it from this layered perspective, we can find that there's evidence for the processes of Basker's model, both the intrapersonal and the interpersonal level. And it's possible to then combine all these different research perspectives within the same epistemology by accepting those limits within CR. And it's, maybe it's possible to extend it to the global level via PISA and other educational movements. So how does this help our understanding of learner autonomy? Well, there's no boundary between autonomy and agency. Autonomy is a subset of agency. I think a lot of the having read a lot of the literature on learner autonomy that focuses on the cognitive perspective, this separation of agency and autonomy is really about the convenience of research rather than a definite proof of, that a social perspective is wrong. Autonomy is also historical, so the student experiences will affect observed autonomy and agency. So students with little or no experience of autonomy are less likely to value it within specific social fields. The moment the students enter the classroom, they maybe sit up and they're looking like very good students, but they might reject learner autonomy because they're not used to it. They don't see it being valued in a classroom. And they'll display autonomy depending on the specific field. So one student who maybe in English class is very teacher dependent might be more autonomous in a different class and will probably be very autonomous within the student clubs or societies they're members of. And there's this idea of photonomy as well. So some students pretend to be more autonomous because they figure out, oh, okay, this has more value in this particular field. So they make a conscious decision to pretend to be more autonomous because they can find an easier passage through. So let's come back to my argument. How does critical realism help our understanding of learner autonomy? So it places autonomy within the context of an open system that is rational, but also universal. It provides a morphogenic system, right? So we can, within this kind of model, we can see that there are areas where between the different layers where we could imagine there's a better conceptualization that might emerge. And it provides a framework for autonomy as a social activity as well. And critical realism kind of provides this underlaboring. So we can use this, the transformational model of social activity to arrange different parts of learning to understand learner autonomy. So, okay, so we've got stratified reality across 4 dimensions, agency affected by access to or access on practices. So we've got a system of enablements and constraints. And at the intrapersonal level, we've got all the different factors that have been found to affect learner autonomy, things like motivation and others, and cognitive capacity and critical reflection come in. But then at the intrapersonal level, we can also see things that are traditionally associated with learner autonomy, and again at classroom level as well. Going above that, we can see things like structure and curriculum assessments are washback. And what this means is we can combine different research levels as research lenses at different levels to provide more explanatory power. Okay, so I'm sorry, I think maybe I went over time, but we talked about the context. We've talked about critical realism as meta theory. I kind of jumped over the complex dynamic system stuff because we're a bit pressed for time. But well, these are the references. Thank you for your time. Do you have any questions?
Okay, well, thank you again, Dominic. Gregory Paul Glasgow, please.
All right, thank you very much, Dominic, for your presentation. Gave me good food for thought regarding trajectories of learning. I had 2 questions for you. So one has to do with this blurred boundary between autonomy and agency, and I'm still struggling with this issue. I wanted to know if you could elaborate more on your assertion that autonomy is a subset of agency. If you could explain that in more detail. And then secondly, I had a question about the interview data that you collected. As you know, there are, well, actually, there's an interesting article that came out in the Journal of Critical Realism, February 2022, by an Andreas Bronfenbrenner, who stated, and I quote, "Novel researchers less familiar with critical realism risk phrasing interview questions incapable of extracting essential realist information." And so this is something that I'm really interested in learning more about, just how to really impose a critical realist outlook on how interviews are structured. So I wondered if you could tell us about your experiences in putting those questions together and how you,
So, okay, so the first question about why asserting that autonomy is a subset of agency. When you look at the literature, traditionally it was always kind of, this is just the capacity to take charge of learning, and majority is like, this is this. But then if you think, particularly in the interview data, you found that it really didn't help explain sufficiently what the teachers were seeing. And so what you were seeing was that, well, I had one teacher who insisted, this is definitely it. If the student's not displaying patterns of behavior that I think are positive, then they don't have the cognitive capacity to take charge of learning, which I think is, there's a lot of contradictions there, right? You're getting your teacher who is effectively saying, like, effectively imposing a judgment upon upon the agency the student is displaying. This is not autonomy because they are not doing something I think is autonomy, right? So within the critical realist model, particularly the Busker's like on demand, this idea of the cognitive domain is just one small part of it. And when I spoke with other teachers would say, well, this student, he's not very confident, he's very shy in the class, but then I see him in the baseball team and he's got suddenly huge amounts of agency to do things. And, really looking at both the literature, particularly if you read Holek's, the preface, he actually says, like, this is a system to avoid all the chaos of social systems. And that's a lot of what it is like, it's trying to make it a closed system so that you can test for it, that you can prescribe it. And unfortunately, we don't have that, right? It's an open system. We don't understand all of the errors and stuff going on. So my argument is that, yeah, learner autonomy is a subset of agency because it's the thing that, certainly in my research, it's learner autonomy is the thing that the teacher sees amongst all of the student agency that they define as learner autonomy. So it must be a subset of agency from the data research I have. It's just that there's an input judgment of this agency is autonomy, right? And this agency is not autonomy. So it's a subset, effectively. Getting to the interview questions, I would agree with you. It's difficult to really get to what's really happening. I found that with a semi-structured approach, the more I let the interviewee kind of diverge from what they thought was, or what they interpreted as my question, the more interesting results I found. So actually having, allowing the participants to have a much more, I don't know, maybe like it's almost like a kind of a vocalized reflective deliberation with me, was maybe more effective at finding out the kind of what was really happening, or, maybe not really happening, but what they interpreted to be, or they reported was really happening. So Yeah, I would agree. It's like if you go in, I don't think this research would have been as successful if I had taken a very fixed, structured interview approach. Unfortunately, the interviews take time. Having a completely unstructured interview would have been difficult. But having this semi-structured approach, I think, provided a little bit of explanatory power, a little bit. I wouldn't claim to say that I have, I've completely solved the issue of learner autonomy. I think what it does do is it also identifies areas where you could use other, you could even use quantitative instruments to look at. You could look at areas such as, how the policy acts at the institutional level to filter down and affect autonomy and agency that way. I would agree. It's difficult with interviews, but if you can invest the time and have it a little less structured,
the point that you make about a vocalized reflective deliberation is really interesting, and I think that kind of speaks to, because I'm conducting some research right now, and I think that's what I'm finding. And so I have a semi-structured approach, and then what happens with that vocalized reflective deliberation is that sometimes evidence about enablements or constraints pop up, and then that's what becomes very interesting. And it allows you, those kinds of contexts allow you to access that information, and it really enriches the data.
One thing I found was that Japanese students didn't know the kanji for learner autonomy. They knew we got so in Japanese we got you got jiritsu gakushu, but there's a homonym jiritsu gakushu for self-study that's guided by a teacher. And so when I pointed out that this was a different thing, there was like shock, and suddenly like everything was reevaluated from the student's perspective. The difficulty is that you have to invest a lot of time. Each of those interviews I did was at least an hour long, some are a bit longer. It's a lot of time and effort. So
Thank you very much for that.
No, thank you for the question.
Okay, well, I think that's all. Thank you very much, Dominic. Everyone, please give a hand. Dominic Edsall, thank you very much for that presentation. Thank you, Gregory, for the question. I believe Karen Saltzman is here. She's in the room. Awesome. Okay, let's get started in, let's say 2 minutes-ish. Okay, so about 40 past the hour. And we'll get started with you, give everyone a chance to take a break.